So there's a lot that's new in climate change, and a lot of it is pretty fresh. The impetus for this talk came from the near simultaneous publication of two reports. The first of these is an annual report, and this is the 2023 report by the Lancet Countdown on Health and Climate Change, the imperative for a health-centered response to a world facing irreversible harms. That was published around Thanksgiving time. And about the same time, the fifth National Climate Assessment, which is published every 5 years, was published also at the same time. I'll also draw on the work of James Hansen and his group, the Rhodium Group, and a few other organizations such as NOAA. I almost always begin my talks with a little definition of health, because I'm not going to be talking just about broken bones and diseases, but complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity, as is put forth by the definition of health in the World Health Organization in 1948. Now, one of my favorite quotes, which I use all the time because in part I thought it was a good handle to get your letter to the editor published. It turned out to be true. The Lancet Countdown executive summary says that we live in a world accelerating in the wrong direction. And I think that's a theme that pervades a lot of what I'm going to be saying this evening. And in an editorial comment that was published along with the countdown, the author of that said that every dimension tracked by the countdown is worsening as climate changes. Now this is information that I just added to the talk last week when it became available. And this shows the surface temperature of the ocean between 1979 and 2022. There's all of these gray lines. Each line is a different year. In 2023, shown here in red, it started off at the high end and then, whoops, zipped up higher than any of the other averages that were seen before, and that's persisted. This is dated 14 March 2024. Oh, I can't see that that's on my screen here.
Move your mouse so it clicks off the screen. I don't think you need to click on that.
Thank you. Sorry about that.
Go forward. You don't need to use the mouse if you just forward.
There you go.
So this figure was published before that. This is from December 29th in the New York Times, and shows average surface temperature of the Earth since about 1900 to the present time. And it's pretty well known that the past year, 2023, was the hottest that was ever recorded in recorded history. And when you look at this, I don't know what's going on here. I drew this line myself here showing this steady increase. Now some people, notably Jim Hansen and his group, think that it's better to use this blue line and then this heavier blue line, because they're concerned that in the past several years the rate of change of the surface temperature of the Earth has been accelerating. And they have a very good rationale for that. Here's part of it. But I'm not going to talk about that. But to get to the point of what Hansen was reporting in that paper, I have to go into the weeds just a little bit and talk about some of the factors that drive climate change. And one of those is radiative forcing, which is a measure of the influence that a factor has on altering the balance of incoming and outgoing energy from the Earth atmosphere system. In other words, this is how greenhouse gases work. Now, a lot of us know about CO2, and this is a history derived from ice core samples that have been retrieved from various portions of the Earth, up until the present time when we began to have the ability to measure carbon dioxide concentrations. And you can see that this concentration has just soared. And every second, there's approximately 1,400 plus tons of carbon dioxide emitted into the atmosphere all year round. The average car generates about 5 tons per year, so it gives you some idea of the magnitude of this. So here's a summary of the various physical drivers of climate change, also known as radiative forcing, from the 6th IPCC report. And it shows the prominent role of carbon dioxide and methane in producing climate change, but also shows working in the opposite direction. And we heard some allusions to this morning in David Benzing's talk, that sulfur dioxide works exactly in opposition to this. And how do I go back? So carbon dioxide works exactly in the opposite direction. And as David's pointed out in the talks this morning, there are 2 primary sources of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. One is volcanic eruptions, over which we have no control, as the residents of Iceland are figuring out once again, and also burning fossil fuels, most notably coal, which has, in some coals, as 9% by weight is actually sulfur, and when you burn it, it comes out the stack as sulfur dioxide. So cognizant of this and the effects of sulfur dioxide on forming small particles, which are the most dangerous of the forms of atmospheric pollution that there are, EPA began to regulate sulfur emissions by power plants. And this graph shows the sulfur emissions from Europe and North America at about the time that EPA began to regulate that. So these have taken a real nosedive in terms of the concentrations. So let's go back to this. So if you reduce the amount of sulfur dioxide in the atmosphere, as is happening, and that's good, you enhance the effects of the others, like carbon dioxide and methane, that are acting in the opposite directions. So this has led some to propose using injections of sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere to act sort of like a false volcanic eruption and enhance this bar here and reflect more of the rays of the sun back into the outer space. Now, a lot of us think that this is a bad idea because even though you may cool the Earth a bit by doing this, the emissions of CO2 will continue unimpeded by this action. And a lot of that CO2 gets dissolved in the ocean and acidifies the ocean. And oceanic acidification is one of the factors, along with rising temperature, that is leading to the attack on reefs and a lot of organisms that live in fresh and salt water that make shells out of carbon dioxide turned into carbonate. So there are those various factors. Plus, also looking at carbon dioxide, that some people say, well, that's like plant fertilizer, let it rip. But the problem with that is that not all plants respond to carbon dioxide in the same way. As I explained in heat advisory a bit, some plants have stimulated growth by CO2, and those are largely weeds like ragweed, thank you. Ragweed and other weeds that compete with crops, which by and large are not responsive to CO2. So you have weeds growing faster than crops, which is not a good thing. So a lot of us think that the so-called geoengineering is a bad idea. In fact, the National Academy of Science published a treatise about this in book form a couple of years ago. And they eschewed the use of the term geoengineering because by adding engineering on it, created the false perception that this was a much more precise strategy for dealing with climate change. So they used climate transformation or some kind of other euphemism. Also, climate change is rare to see in official government publications. They'll talk about global change. It's my understanding that global change was introduced by the military during the Trump administration because Trump, being a climate change denier, didn't want to see climate change appearing in official government publications. But meanwhile, the military is doing more than almost any branch of the government to adapt to climate change. So back to the main story here at hand. So Hansen and his people think that there's an exaggerated effect of CO2 and methane because of diminishing concentration of sulfur dioxide. So this is where greenhouse gas emissions come from for the most part. And you look here at transport, that's relatively constant for the last almost 20 years. Industrial emissions of carbon dioxide equivalents are about the same, and carbon dioxide emissions by buildings are also pretty static. But emissions by power plants have gone down a lot, as shown by this black line. And this shows the result of the stack emissions, in part due to mercury emissions and also sulfur emissions. But along with that, there's been a transformation from coal to natural gas as a power source for generating electricity. Along with that, the slope of these two lines is pretty close to being the same. The renewable energy sources, shown by this blue line, have also risen, but not nearly enough. And our state lawmakers in 2021 passed a law that gives each county the right to ban construction of large-scale wind and solar arrays in unincorporated areas of various counties. And as of the middle of summer of 2022, 10 have done so. And I believe I heard that Mahoning County recently also enacted one of these bans. And guess who's behind all of that? The fossil fuel industry. And right now, the influence of the fossil fuel industry has made it possible for our former Speaker of the House to enjoy an all-expenses-paid vacation in a government-maintained resort that has a bar in every room. So one of the things that's also new about climate change is that there's been, in modeling, much less emphasis on just carbon dioxide emissions. So they've created this variable called shared socioeconomic pathways that are used in modeling to predict the effects of various things on the future. And the elements that go into these SSPs are energy, very heavily energy weighted. Gross domestic product and various measures, the degree of urbanization, how land is used, that includes agriculture and emissions that come from the agricultural sector, changes in population, and air pollution. So it's a much more complex variable than just CO2 equivalent emissions. So that gives rise to various scenarios. The SSP1, which is a sustainable pathway that takes into account huge reductions in emissions and other adaptive measures. And then there's the business as usual SSP5, which predicts the huge rises in CO2 equivalent emissions and also drastic changes in climate. And SSP2 is much more sort of middle of the road. So that when you create graphs that predict the future here, so these are historical changes, and these are predicted change bases on modeling. And this is the high emissions scenario, which predicts a much worse future than the low emissions scenario. So with the rhodium climate outlook, they predict that by 2100, the mean surface temperature is likely to be somewhere around 2.8 degrees centigrade, far above the 1.5 degree standard that was, or objective that was put forward in the Paris agreements. And we're going to be, or anyone, not we, but our children and grandchildren who are surviving are going to have a much more difficult time of it than we are. So I'd like to now turn to some of the findings or the publication with the emphasis on the Middle West, which is where we live. This is the cover of that assessment. Comes out every 5 years. And there's a number of key advances since the fourth National Climate Assessment. There's less uncertainty in the numbers and the data that are presented. And that's improved the result of better data and improved modeling strategies, which have narrowed the estimates of the impacts of atmospheric carbon dioxide on climate. There's a huge improvement in attribution, which I'll talk about in just a bit more in a second here, so that there's a higher confidence in the ability to link the effects of climate change on specific disasters, like the floods in Houston, heat waves, hurricanes, and the like, which you're likely to see on the news, where they will report that, well, 10% of these effects are likely to be due to climate change. And that's due to the advances in attribution studies. A moment ago, I mentioned by the improvements that are made by including social and economic pathways in the models. And now there are also new, better models that are more detailed that lead to a better understanding of how climate change will affect regional processes. So a word about attribution studies, because this has the potential for being a poorly understood business. So these attribution studies arose largely due to the efforts of Peter Stott, who's a Norwegian climatologist, I believe. And what he and his colleagues did was to take data, weather data from the mid-1800s, before climate change, before CO2 levels started rising, and using those data from the early part of that period to make predictions about what was expected to occur in the later part of that period. So they tweaked the models until the model arrived at something that was as close as possible to what was actually observed. So they've now used these data from the mid-1800s and so forth, before the industrial age really got rolling, and predict what the weather and climate would be like if there was no CO2 in the atmosphere. So they're using the pre-CO2 to predict what would be seen in the high CO2. And in their first study, Stott and his colleagues looked at the heat wave that gripped Europe in the summer of 2003, where there were between 60 and 70,000 deaths that were due to heat. And heat worldwide, and particularly in the United States, remains the leading cause of weather-related deaths, and was one of the factors that went into the choice of heat advisory as a title. Thank you. The title of the book that Anne mentioned. So Stott and his colleagues estimated that climate change doubled the risk of exceeding threshold temperatures in that heat wave. And since then, there have been continued use and refinement of attribution studies. Now let's look at, for a few moments now, some of the predictions that are made for what's likely to happen in the Midwest section. And the climate assessment divides the country into different regions and has chapters and sections about each of them. And in the Midwest, they predict that arthropod-borne illnesses, particularly mosquito-borne illnesses, are likely to increase and become more prevalent. These include some diseases that have never been seen or not seen due to person-to-person transmission in Ohio. Diseases like dengue, also West Nile virus. A lot of us remember the epidemic of West Nile virus, and Zika, all transmitted by mosquitoes. Ticks carry Lyme, and we know about Lyme, and checking for mosquitoes, for ticks if we go wandering up on Wildflower Hill or even on the grassy areas in front of Heiser. So Lyme disease and Rocky Mountain spotted fever are likely to become more prevalent, as is histoplasmosis, which is a fungal disease. And I venture to say that there's more than one person in the audience tonight who's had a chest x-ray and their doctor says, oh, we saw a nodule in your lung on your chest x-ray. Were you ever a cigarette smoker? Because that's really the first question you ask, because that's often how lung cancer is seen initially. And a lot of the times that answer is no. So then there are serial chest x-rays or CT scans looking for changes in size and deposition of calcium in those nodules, which are a sign of a benign process. And many times that's due to histoplasmosis that's been contracted elsewhere, because it's a disease that's all around us. So continuing to zero in on the Midwest, there are 5 key messages that are in the climate assessment for us. And those have to do with agriculture. We heard some about that this morning. Ecosystems and the services rendered by ecosystems. Our services are, not where you go give somebody $1 and they give you a Big Mac or something like that. This is providing food and shelter and a lot of the intangible features of the ecosystems, preventing rainwater runoff and flooding and the like. Community health, big deal. Costly effects of climate change on industries and agriculture, and also changes in water quality and quantity. So let me just talk a bit about this. David talked about, he used a different term. He didn't use climate smart practices. The term you used was what? Regenerative agriculture. Basically, it's the same thing. The authors of the climate change assessment noted there have been changes in precipitation extremes, changes in times of snow melt and early spring rainfall that pose challenges to crop and animal agriculture, including increased pest and disease transmission, muddier pastures. We've all looked out driving north on 58 and seen those fields that are all have standing water, and further degradation of water quality. And they attributed this as being a likely effect with a high level of confidence. They also encouraged the adoption of climate smart agricultural practices and other adaptive techniques to provide a potential health towards environmental and economic stability. And they were less confident of this than they were of the changes in precipitation extremes. So the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization defines climate smart agriculture as an agriculture that sustainably increases productivity and resilience and reduces or removes greenhouse gases and enhances the achievement of national food security. And this is a picture of a Kubota electric tractor, which is one of many, many different things that can be done. And we heard a lot about that this morning from David. Adapting ecosystems and services. They note that a wide range of species will be affected by climate change. There's been a huge diminution in the number of birds and bird species in the United States and in the Midwest. They talk about flooding and drought impacts and rising temperatures due to less snow and ice, and loss of economic, cultural, and health and well-being benefits. Now, who wouldn't feel better if you were walking down a path and you saw this in front of you, a path with wildflowers on either side of you? People go out of the way to do this kind of stuff. So adaptation and mitigation are almost certain to improve health and health equity in the Middle East as it will, in the Midwest as it will in the rest of the country. It's been known for some time that land surface area temperatures in areas that were previously redlined for purposes of mortgage allocation, that is to say discrimination against black people and poor people, those are higher than they are in better socioeconomic grouped areas. So, this is a phenomenon that occurs all across the United States and amounts to several degrees on average in the redlined areas. This causes the people who live there to spend more on electricity, weatherproofing their house, spending on air conditioning and the like. There are social and racial factors that are involved there. It's the poor people that live in the previously redlined areas. And if you throw in a wild card on top of that, like COVID, everything gets worse for everybody. But the low end of the socioeconomic spectrum bears the brunt of those effects. So they also talk about the economic benefits of adaptation and mitigation. And rising temperatures and extreme precipitation will have deleterious effects on an aging infrastructure and electrical grid. Flooding disrupts transportation. And we've all seen, if you listen to the news reports in the morning about on WKSU, you hear a traffic report and they say there's flooding at this and this street and that street, or I-480 is backed up due to this or that. And some of that is due to flooding and changes that are caused by climate change. And it's also necessary to improve the built environment and eliminate, to the extent possible, what are known as urban heat islands, where dense concentrations of skyscrapers and the like absorb heat and then re-radiate it at night so it doesn't cool off as much, and produces a heat profile that starts off in rural areas and gradually gets hotter as you get towards downtown areas. And some cities, like Atlanta, Georgia, actually have weather patterns that are associated with the heat island effect that's quite prominent in that city. Now, over my career as an advocate and lobbyist for Physicians for Social Responsibility and other organizations, one of the things that is almost always true, regardless of whose congressional office you go into, and this would be J.D. Vance's office, Bob Latta's office, you hear about, oh, we're really in favor of preserving the Great Lakes. That's something that everybody can get behind, regardless of political affiliation. By the way, you also hear about that from Sherrod Brown. There are predicted to be adverse effects on ecosystem health, surface and groundwater, and widespread effects in the Mississippi Basin and Great Lakes ecosystems. We heard about erosion this morning, a bit about algal blooms, and the cyanobacteria that release toxins that affect the liver, the nervous system, and other body organs. And in 2019, there was a 3-day period of time when the Toledo city water supply was shut down because of the cyanobacteria toxins that were in the water supply. And the people of Toledo were told not to drink that water and not even to touch it, because the toxins were that much of a threat. And this is a satellite photograph of Lake Erie taken in 2022, showing an algal bloom here in the western end of the lake, near where the Maumee River empties into the lake, and along with the water, a lot of phosphates that are run off from agricultural, industrial agricultural practices. The central and the eastern end of the lake is much less severely affected. I'm going to say a few things about the southeast. Although we don't live there, many of us have friends and family who live there. Those people are going to be confronted with rising sea level, extreme weather events that are already present, and as oceans warm, the energy to propel hurricanes becomes more prevalent, so you can expect more severe storms of that nature. And these will worsen with every increment in global warming. And there will also be health and economic effects. So we lived, as Ann mentioned, we lived in Houston, and luckily after we met, Hurricane Harvey came along and deposited 50 inches of rain in some parts of Houston in about a 4 or 5 days time. And this is a picture of two guys in a raft paddling along by this street sign. You may not be able to read that, but this is Brays Boulevard. And our house was just a few blocks from Brays Boulevard, a few miles, a distance away from where this photograph was taken. And I'm not sure what the blood alcohol level of these guys was. It might have been high. But here are those same two guys standing on a stepladder next to the same sign showing just how much water there was in excess due to the storm and the deposition of huge amounts of water. Now, sea level rise is going to be a big deal in Florida in spite of the denial of climate change by state officials and some national officials. So this is a prediction made by Climate Central that shows the amount of flooding shown here in blue on some of the barrier islands near South Florida. And these will all be inundated with unchecked emissions. And there's a well-known residence right here at the end of these arrows, the Mar-a-Lago club owned by Donald Trump. And that's going to get washed away in the event of I don't know whether that'll get picked up by the microphones or not, but we can circulate one around. So the Southwest is also not going to be a very nice place to live. There's already drought and arid conditions that affect a great deal of the Southwest, where extreme heat compromises human health. As I said before, that's the leading cause of weather-related death. And a lot of us have seen the effects of wildfires and the air pollution that travels to the east as a result of that. Now, one of the tools that's available online that's sponsored by NOAA is this little device here, where you can pick any place on the Earth, drop a marker, and set a year, and find out how many days over 95 degrees Fahrenheit there are likely to be in that year. And when you do that, you see that there were 148 days in 2020. I have a sister who lives in a suburb of Phoenix, and for a month last summer, there were every day in a row the temperature exceeded 115 degrees. That's really hot. And that's bordering on the extreme of temperature where no matter what you do, stand in the shade, douse yourself with water, wear a wet t-shirt, you cannot stay cool enough to prevent your core body temperature from rising and producing heat exhaustion or heat stroke. And heat stroke is often a fatal condition. So by 2050, they're predicting these 148 days will expand to 165 days. And by 2090, 10 years short of the end of the century, 192 days are predicted. That's over half of the days in the year where the temperature will exceed 95 degrees Fahrenheit. And you can see, if you've been looking at the scale here, the rest of the country is going to be warming as well. So the 2023 Lancet report, called the Countdown to Health, Climate Change and the Imperative for a Health-Centered Response in a World Facing Irreversible Harms, begins by a couple of statements. In 2022, the authors of the report, the 2023 report, by the way, had 114 authors, so it's a very diverse group of specialists who put this report together. They warned that the people's health is at the mercy of fossil fuels, and stressed the transformative ability of jointly tackling the concurrent opportunity of climate change, energy, cost of living, and crises for human health and well-being. But the 2023 report says this year's report finds few signs of such progress. So the executive summary of the countdown has 5 different sections. One about the rising health toll of the changing climate, the human costs of persistent inaction due to climate, a section called A World Accelerating in the Wrong Direction, opportunities to deliver a healthy future for everyone, and concluding with a people-centered transformation that puts health at the heart of climate action. And I hope to convince you that using that broad definition of health, there's hardly a person in the world who's going to escape some adverse effects of climate change. So starting off with the rising toll of climate change, they note that in 2020, over 60% of days when temperatures threatened health were made twice as likely by anthropogenic climate change. Here's that projection again, and attribution. They noted that heat-related deaths among those of us 65 years old and higher increased by 85% in 2020 compared to a baseline between 1900 and 2000. And heat and droughts in 2021 were thought to be associated with 127 million or more people who had food insecurity. Looking at some of the human costs of inaction, a temperature rise of just under 2 degrees. Now, remember, the Rhodium group is predicting 2.8 degrees by the end of the century. A temperature rise of just under 2 degrees will lead to a 370% increase in heat-related deaths by 2050. That's a lot. They note that over 500 million people or more live in an environment of food insecurity, and that was before the conflict in Gaza and other parts of the world that are just being ripped apart by civil wars and violence and conflict. Vibrio infections, read cholera here, are predicted to increase by 15 to 25%. Cholera is a highly contagious, terrible disease that fortunately now there's a vaccine for prevention of cholera and effective treatments if you're able to get to a place where they can do rehydration therapy. A single organism is estimated to be sufficient inoculum to produce cholera in a susceptible individual. Dengue, there's no dengue right now in Lorain County, and I asked the Lorain County health professionals who were here a couple of weeks ago whether they'd ever seen a case of dengue, and they say no, but it's a reportable disease, and if there is a case, they will learn about it. There is dengue in Texas and some in Florida and a lot in Puerto Rico. Several thousand deaths a year among Puerto Ricans due to dengue. So if you think our drinking water is bad, think of this young black man here holding up this glass of water. He wouldn't want to be drinking that. And this is an Aedes aegypti mosquito, the same one that carries dengue and a bunch of other nasty diseases that you don't want to have. And a lot of people say that this is the second most dangerous animal on the face of the earth. Here's a room full of the most dangerous animals. So they also said that we live in a world that's accelerating in the wrong direction. And they back that statement up with information about energy-related emissions of CO2. And in 2022, they set a record of 36.8 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalents, with only 9.5% of electricity coming from renewable sources and driven by huge profits from oil and gas, the fossil fuel industry, same industry that led to the shutdown of plans to build a wind farm in Lake Erie. First Energy opposed that, kept suing the potential developers till they gave up and went away. They couldn't afford to stay in the fight. So First Energy won again. They predict that CO2 emissions will surpass Paris goals by 173% by 2040, and that's not very far from the present time. the world is accelerating in the wrong direction. Then they close with an opportunity to deliver a healthy future for everyone. They note that over 700 million people live without electricity. 1 billion are served by healthcare facilities without a reliable supply of energy. Poor nations, of course, fare the least well, and there are 1 million deaths per year from inhalation of particulates. And here's a woman who is cooking with an indoor fire. Wood smoke and worse, coal used for indoor cooking is a terrible source of indoor pollution in many third world countries and responsible for lots and lots of illnesses. So they ask us to consider delivering a healthy future for everyone. Fossil fuels account for 95% of road transport, causing around 460,000 deaths per year from particulates. Food systems are responsible for about 30% of global greenhouse gas emissions, and 57% of those are involved in the production of red meat and milk. And when we moved to Kendall in Langston, they had signs on Monday that said Meatless Monday, which is a practice that we've continued to endorse. We had some delicious halibut last night that we got at the Whole Foods market. So there's the people who advocate eschewing red meat have a valid point. And they also note the deaths from fossil fuel pollution, although they're down 15.7% since 2005. And 80% of this is due to less use of coal, which I talked about in the beginning. There's a better scientific understanding of links between health and climate change. In 2022, they found 3,000 papers approximately that were published in the peer-reviewed literature. About a quarter of newspaper articles featured health in 2022 publications, and 95% of nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement referred to health, up from 73% just 4 years ago. So there are discernible signs of progress, certainly in the worlds of information. So what can we as Kendallites do? Well, we need, this is a projection or an article about government action and climate change, and clearly governmental action is necessary to get things done on the scale that's required. It requires political leadership. So we have one candidate for president in favor of combating climate change, and another who is not a climate change denier, told us that we should inject ourselves with bleach to treat COVID. We need institutional organizations to execute these policies. Organizations like the Environmental Protection Agency, the Energy Department. Unfortunately, we have a Supreme Court that seems prone to rolling back these changes that are protective. And sadly, Ohio is one of the states that's leading the charge by opposing the good neighbor, so-called good neighbor rules that would require Ohio and other states that are big emitters to cut back their emissions that are drifting into other states. We need stakeholder involvement. That's you, you're stakeholders. We need more climate change information, and progress is being made there. We need to encourage decision analysis and evidence-based decision-making tools, not leaping to conclusions or hearing rumors and proliferation of false information. A better consideration of the barriers to transforming the environment, more research and development, and for those of us who made a career of science, you need funding to make all of this work. So I'm a physician, as Anne said, and we tend to think of problems from a medical perspective. And in a public health world, we talk about things that are primary prevention, the steps that are needed to keep a disease or a phenomenon from arising in the first place, like reducing salt intake to reduce the risk of developing hypertension and death from stroke and heart attack. So you need reduced greenhouse gas emissions. And then there's secondary prevention. Once you have the disease, and it's hard to ignore the fact that climate change is upon us, we need to support federal, state, and local efforts to adapt as well as mitigate climate change. And it's important to remember that everyone can do something. You don't have to be an author of a book, but you do need to vote and hold candidates responsible for the positions that they take, and do your part as an informed citizen. Remember, your expertise as an informed, concerned citizen or healthcare provider makes you, not the guy sitting next to you or the woman sitting next to you, highly qualified to discuss this issue because you have the most at stake along with your children and grandchildren. So that's all, folks. Thank you for coming and your attention.